I can still picture that afternoon vividly, as the sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the surface of Lake Geneva in shimmering hues of gold and amber. It was the grand celebration for the 40th anniversary of Vanguard Logistics, the sprawling empire my father had built from nothing more than a single battered truck and an outsized ambition. The family lake house, perched on the lake shore like a crown jewel, had been transformed into a vision of opulence. Manicured gardens stretching down to the water, an infinity pool reflecting the sky, and long banquet tables draped in white linen, adorned with fresh flowers flown in from the Netherlands. Everything screamed wealth, power, and triumph, the very qualities my family loved to parade before the world. But to me, Alyssa, it was all just a glittering facade hiding the deep fissures beneath. At 31, I was an independent woman with a freelance graphic design career in a quiet town hours away from all this. I rarely came home, but this time my mother's invitation had felt impossible to refuse. "You have to come, Alyssa. This is a big family milestone," she'd said over the phone, her voice a mix of honeyed warmth and unmistakable command. I knew exactly what family meant in this context. My parents, my older brother Christopher, the anointed heir to the Vanguard throne, his wife Emily, and their two children, Mason and Lily. And me? I was always the extra, the odd piece that didn't quite fit into their perfect picture. From childhood, I'd grown accustomed to being looked through, like a glass child, invisible unless someone needed a contrast to highlight everyone else's brilliance. The party unfolded beneath enormous white tents, alive with hundreds of guests, business partners, senior executives, and notable figures from the logistics world. Soft jazz drifted from the live band, mingling with animated conversation and the delicate clink of champagne flutes. My father, Victor, stood on the small stage in a flawlessly tailored suit, recounting the 40-year journey of Vanguard with that deep, resonant voice full of pride. "From a tiny garage to a global empire," he declared, and the crowd erupted in enthusiastic applause. My mother, Helena, stood beside him, radiant in a sequined evening gown, smiling as though she'd orchestrated the entire evening herself. Christopher was busy shaking hands with VIPs. Emily cradled little Lily, their picture-perfect daughter, in her arms, and Mason, their rambunctious 12-year-old, darted about in a miniature tuxedo that made him look like a pint-sized version of his father. I lingered at the edge of the garden, clutching a glass of plain water instead of champagne, watching everything from a safe distance. No one drew me into conversation. No one asked about my life. I was used to it. For 31 years, I'd functioned as a kind of emotional bank of tolerance, silently absorbing withdrawal after withdrawal without ever receiving a deposit in return. The subtle digs from Christopher, the condescending glances from Emily, the way my parents always prioritized him in every decision. I endured it all because I believed it was the price of keeping whatever fragile peace remained. But that afternoon, the account was about to go bankrupt. When dinner was finally served, I decided to get some food. The buffet tables stretched on forever, laden with luxuries: grilled lobster, Wagyu beef, organic salads, and exquisite desserts crafted by a Michelin-starred chef. I picked up a plate and joined the line quietly, trying not to draw attention. Then Mason appeared. He skidded to a halt right in front of me, hands on his hips, cheeks flushed with excitement. In that shrill, self-important voice only a child trying to sound grown-up can manage, he shouted, "Charity cases eat last!" Time seemed to freeze. Laughter rippled outward. First a few stifled giggles, then a full wave of open amusement. I glanced around. Christopher was doubled over, clapping his son on the back as if it were the wittiest joke he'd ever heard. Emily covered her mouth but couldn't hide her sparkling eyes. My parents stood not far away. They offered only faint, indulgent smiles and said nothing. No reprimand for Mason, no protective glance toward me. They let the words hang in the air like a verdict. Yes, Alyssa is the charity case, the unwanted daughter who contributes nothing to the family legacy. A cold heat spread from my chest to my face. Not explosive rage, but the icy clarity of realization. Mason's outburst wasn't random. It was the natural outgrowth of the culture my family had cultivated. A 12-year-old doesn't invent that kind of cruelty in a vacuum. He absorbs it from the adults around him, from Christopher's casual labels of me as the failed sister, from the way my parents lavished everything on him, from overheard conversations that dismissed me entirely. It was the perfect symbol of how deeply contempt had taken root, passed down like an heirloom. And in that moment, the cup finally overflowed. My bank of tolerance was empty. I was done being the glass child. With a calm that surprised even me, I set the plate back down on the table without a word. I turned and walked away through the garden, past the lingering laughter that still echoed behind me. The lake glimmered under the setting sun, almost whispering encouragement. Go, Alyssa, don't look back. And I didn't. That party wasn't just a celebration of 40 years of Vanguard logistics. It marked the end of my own 31 years of silent endurance. From that day forward, I would build a life that didn't require their approval or their presence. The engine of my sleek black Audi purred softly as I navigated the winding roads away from the lake house, the fading lights of the party shrinking in my rearview mirror until they were nothing more than distant specks against the darkening sky. The drive back to the city was a long one, over 2 hours of highway that cut through rolling hills and dense forests. But I welcomed the solitude. It gave me time to process the evening's events, to let the sting of Mason's words settle into something more manageable, like a bruise that would fade but leave a scar. The radio was off. I preferred the quiet hum of tires on asphalt, punctuated only by the occasional whoosh of a passing car. My mind wandered back to the laughter, the indifference, and that final decisive moment when I walked away. No dramatic exit, no shouted accusations, just a quiet severance as clean as a surgeon's cut. As the city skyline began to emerge on the horizon, twinkling like a constellation of steel and glass, I felt a familiar sense of relief wash over me. Home wasn't the sprawling estate by the lake, it was my penthouse in the heart of downtown, a sanctuary I'd carved out for myself, high above the bustling streets. I pulled into the underground garage, the security gate sliding open with a soft beep, and took the private elevator straight up to the top floor. The doors opened into a spacious foyer where floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic views of the city lights stretching out like a glittering sea. The place was a testament to modern luxury, minimalist design with clean lines, marble countertops in the open-concept kitchen, a living room furnished with plush leather sofas and abstract art pieces I'd collected from galleries around the world. There was a home gym in one corner, a library stocked with first-edition books in another, and a balcony that overlooked the river winding through the urban landscape. But what struck most visitors, if I ever had any, was the absence of personal touches. No family photos adorned the walls or mantel. No framed snapshots of childhood holidays. No group portraits from holidays or graduations. The space was mine, untainted by reminders of the past. I'd made sure of that. As I kicked off my heels and poured myself a glass of chilled white wine from the built-in fridge, I sank into the sofa and stared out at the night. This was my world, built brick by brick on my own terms. And yet, tonight, the ghosts of my family lingered, forcing me to confront the role I'd played in their story for so long. They called it being a glass child. I'd come across the term years ago in a psychology article, and it had hit me like a revelation, a perfect label for the invisible existence I'd endured. In families like mine, where all the attention orbits around a golden child, the glass child is the one who's healthy, capable, and self-sufficient enough to be overlooked. We're transparent, see-through. People look right past us because we don't demand the spotlight or cause problems. We fade into the background, our needs unmet, our achievements unnoticed, while the golden child soaks up every ounce of praise, resources, and affection. In my case, Christopher was the golden one, the firstborn son, the prodigy who followed in Dad's footsteps with effortless grace. From the moment he was born, he was the center of the universe. Mom and Dad poured everything into him: the best schools, the private tutors, the introductions to influential contacts in the logistics industry. He was groomed to take over Vanguard, and he did so spectacularly, expanding the company into new markets and raking in accolades. Me? I was the afterthought, the surprise baby who arrived 5 years later when they weren't planning on expanding the family further. I was smart, sure, top of my class without much effort, but that only made it easier for them to ignore me. Alyssa's fine, they'd say. She doesn't need the extra help. And so I learned to be independent, to forge my own path without their guidance or support. I put myself through college on scholarships and part time jobs, graduating with a degree in finance that they barely acknowledged. To them, I was just the quiet daughter who moved away and got some ordinary office job. They never bothered to ask for details, assuming it was something mundane, like data entry or administrative work. Why dig deeper when the golden child was shining so brightly? But the truth? Oh, the truth was a delicious secret I'd guarded for over a decade. I wasn't some mid level clerk shuffling papers in a cubicle. I was a senior portfolio manager at one of the top investment firms in the city, overseeing a portfolio worth hundreds of millions of dollars. My decisions influenced markets, shaped fortunes, and generated returns that made headlines in financial circles. My personal net worth had climbed north of 20 million, thanks to savvy investments, stock options, and a few high-stakes ventures that paid off handsomely. I owned this penthouse outright, along with a vacation home in the mountains and a diversified portfolio that ensured I'd never have to rely on anyone again. If my family knew, they'd be stunned, perhaps even envious. But that's precisely why I kept it hidden. I wasn't a victim in this story, far from it. I was the architect of my own success, and I'd chosen silence as my shield. Revealing my achievements would only invite exploitation. Christopher would see me as a potential investor for his latest Vanguard expansion. Mom and Dad would suddenly remember I existed, perhaps expecting me to contribute to the family legacy, or worse, guilting me into forgiveness for years of neglect. And Emily? She'd probably start dropping hints about family loans for their kids' private schools. No, thank you. I'd built this life away from their shadow, and I intended to keep it that way. The glass child had learned to reflect light in her own direction, creating a brilliance they couldn't touch. As I sipped my wine and watched the city pulse below, I felt a quiet resolve solidify. The drive home had been more than a physical journey. It was the final stretch of a much longer road, one that led me away from the illusions of family bonds and toward the unapologetic truth of my independence. Tomorrow I'd wake up to a world of my own making, free from the weight of expectations that never included me. And for the first time in years, that felt like enough. The morning after the garden party, I woke up in my penthouse with the sun streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across the polished hardwood floors. The city below was already alive with the hum of traffic and the distant wail of sirens, a stark contrast to the serene, artificial perfection of the lake house. I brewed a pot of strong coffee in my state-of-the-art kitchen, the aroma filling the air as I settled into my home office. It was a room designed for focus, a large oak desk, dual monitors displaying real-time market data, and shelves lined with financial reports and strategy books. As I sipped my coffee and scrolled through emails, my mind inevitably drifted back to the previous night. Mason's cruel words echoed in my head, but they weren't what kept me up half the night. No, it was the weight of a secret I'd carried for 5 years. A secret that could shatter the fragile illusion of my family's empire if it ever came to light. It all started 5 years ago, during what the media dubbed the logistics crunch of 2021. The global supply chain had been ravaged by a perfect storm. Lingering effects from the pandemic, skyrocketing fuel prices, geopolitical tensions disrupting trade routes, and a series of cyber attacks on major ports. Vanguard Logistics, for all its vaunted success, wasn't immune. My father had expanded aggressively in the years leading up to it, acquiring smaller competitors and investing heavily in new warehouse technologies. But when the crunch hit, contracts dried up, debts mounted, and cash flow turned into a trickle. I remember reading about it first in a Financial Times article that popped up in my newsfeed. Vanguard on the brink, family-run giant faces potential bankruptcy. The piece detailed how the company was hemorrhaging millions, with creditors circling like vultures and shareholders demanding answers. I wasn't surprised. Even from afar, I'd kept loose tabs on Vanguard through public filings and industry reports. Part of my job as a portfolio manager required staying ahead of market trends. But what did surprise me was the phone call from my mother a few days later. It wasn't a plea for help. Helena would never stoop to that with me. Instead, it was a rambling monologue about how Christopher is handling everything brilliantly and how the family was rallying together. She mentioned offhand that they were seeking emergency investors to bridge the gap, but her tone implied it was all under control. No questions about my life, No hint that they might need or even value my input. I hung up feeling that familiar mix of resignation and quiet anger. They still saw me as the glass child, irrelevant to their grand narrative. But I couldn't just stand by and watch it all crumble. Despite everything, the years of being overlooked, the subtle exclusions, the way they'd funneled every resource toward Christopher, I still cared. Deep down, Vanguard wasn't just a company, it was my father's life's work. The foundation of the family legacy that, flawed as it was, had shaped who I am. So, I made a decision that would change everything, though they'd never know it. I didn't want their gratitude or their indebtedness. I wanted to protect what mattered without entangling myself further in their web. That's when I created Ironclad Capital. Ironclad was a shell company, meticulously set up through a series of offshore entities and anonymous trusts to obscure my involvement. I'd learned the ins and outs of such structures in my finance career, tools typically used by high net worth clients to safeguard assets or make discreet investments. It took me a couple of weeks to get everything in place. Legal paperwork filed in Delaware for anonymity, a neutral third-party law firm to act as the front, and a carefully crafted proposal that positioned Ironclad as a venture capital firm specializing in turnaround opportunities for logistics firms. The offer was straightforward, an infusion of $5.1 million in exchange for a 37% equity stake and a silent seat on the board. Silent meaning no voting rights in day-to-day operations, no public presence, just the ability to monitor from the shadows and veto major decisions if things went south again. I remember wiring the funds from one of my personal investment accounts, watching the transaction confirmation pop up on my screen. It was a significant chunk of my savings at the time, money I'd earned through years of smart trades, bonuses, and calculated risks in the market. But it felt right. Vanguard accepted the deal almost immediately. They were desperate, and Ironclad's terms were fair, if not generous. Christopher handled the negotiations, of course, puffing up his chest in press releases about how his strategic vision had attracted this mysterious investor. Dad praised him endlessly, and Mom sent out family emails gushing about the miracle that saved them. They speculated endlessly about who was behind Ironclad, some reclusive billionaire perhaps, or a foreign consortium, but never once considered it could be me. Why would they? In their eyes, I was still the underachieving daughter scraping by in some forgettable job. Over the next few years, I watched from afar as Vanguard rebounded spectacularly. The investment paid off handsomely. Under Christopher's leadership, bolstered by my capital, they pivoted to more resilient supply chain models, integrated AI for efficiency, and expanded into e-commerce fulfillment. Profits soared and the company's valuation tripled. My 37% stake grew into a fortune on paper, but I never touched it. The silent board seat gave me access to quarterly reports and insider updates, which I reviewed in secret, ensuring the company stayed on track without ever revealing myself. It was my insurance policy, a way to honor the family tie while maintaining my independence. And yet, even after that lifeline, nothing changed in how they treated me. The invitations to family events remained perfunctory, the conversations superficial. At holidays, Christopher would boast about saving the company single-handedly, and my parents would nod along, their pride reserved solely for him. Emily would chime in with stories of their lavish vacations funded by Vanguard's resurgence, while I sat quietly, biting my tongue. They had no idea that the charity case they'd mocked was the very reason they still had a company to boast about. It was the ultimate irony. I wasn't just the overlooked sibling, I was the betrayed benefactor, the hidden hand that had pulled them from the abyss. Sitting in my office that morning, staring at the market charts flickering on my screen, I realized that secret had become my atomic bomb, a revelation I could detonate at any moment to upend their world. But for now, I held it close, a source of quiet power. Saving Vanguard 5 years ago had been an act of love, a final thread connecting me to the family I'd once hoped to belong to. But after the garden party, that thread had snapped. Love had turned to indifference, and soon perhaps to something sharper. They could keep their illusions. I had my truth, and it was worth far more than their approval. As I turned back to my work, managing portfolios that dwarfed Vanguard's troubles, I felt a sense of liberation. The big secret wasn't just about the money, it was about reclaiming my story. one hidden investment at a time. The city lights twinkled far below my penthouse balcony as I stood there that evening, a half-empty glass of Cabernet in hand, watching the river snake through the urban glow. It was late, past 10, and the events of the garden party felt both impossibly distant and achingly immediate. Mason's shrill voice still rang in my ears, the laughter of my family echoing like a cruel soundtrack. I had spent the day in meetings, orchestrating multi-million-dollar trades with the calm precision that had become second nature. But now, alone in the quiet of my home, the emotional dam finally cracked. Not with tears or rage, though. Something colder, sharper, and infinitely more deliberate was taking shape. My phone buzzed on the kitchen island. I walked inside, glanced at the screen, and felt a bitter smile tug at my lips. A text from Dad. Victor Hargrove himself, the man who had barely acknowledged me at the party. Victor. Alyssa, hope you got home safe. Listen, we're looking at a small cash flow hiccup with a new fleet acquisition. Christopher thinks a bridge loan of about $2 million would smooth things over until Q1 revenue hits. Family helps family, right? Let me know if you can swing it. No rush. Couple of weeks is fine. I stared at the message for a long minute. No apology for the party. No mention of Mason's behavior. No curiosity about how I was doing after walking away mid-event. Just a casual ask for $2 million, as if I were a convenient ATM they kept on standby. They still believed I was the struggling freelance designer living paycheck to paycheck. The irony was almost poetic. The very company they were trying to prop up with my supposed charity had been saved once before by my money. And now they were coming back for more, oblivious to the fact that I held the power to end it all. I didn't reply. I set the phone face down and opened my laptop instead. The screen's glow illuminated the dark living room as I pulled up a secure, encrypted email client I used for sensitive transactions. In the address bar, I typed a single name, David Langford, my longtime attorney, a brilliant corporate lawyer in his late 50s who specialized in complex equity deals and had helped me structure Ironclad Capital 5 years earlier. David knew everything. He was the only person on earth who understood the full scope of my involvement with Vanguard, bound by attorney-client privilege, and paid handsomely to keep it that way. I began drafting the email with the kind of detached clarity I usually reserved for closing 8-figure positions. No anger bled into the words. No personal grievances. Just cold, professional precision. Subject: exercise of liquidity clause, Ironclad Capital, Vanguard Logistics. Dear David, I hope this email finds you well. After careful consideration, I have decided to invoke the liquidity provision outlined in Section 7.2 of the 2021 Investment Agreement between Ironclad Capital LLC and Vanguard Logistics Inc. Effective immediately, please serve formal notice to the company requiring them to repurchase Ironclad's 37% equity stake at the pre-agreed valuation, multiple of 2.7x invested capital. As you know, this places the repurchase price at $13.7 million USD, payable in full within 30 calendar days of receipt of notice. Should Vanguard Logistics fail to complete the repurchase within the stipulated timeframe, kindly proceed with Option B. Initiate a drag-along sale process pursuant to Section 8.4, offering the entirety of the company to qualified third-party buyers, including, but not limited to, the strategic acquirers we previously identified in the 2023 contingency memo. As always, all communications should continue to preserve the anonymity of the beneficial owner. Ironclad Capital remains a silent partner until or unless the drag-along is triggered. I trust you will handle this with the utmost discretion and efficiency. Please confirm receipt and provide a draft of the notice letter for my review by end of day tomorrow. Best regards, Alyssa. I read it through twice, making minor adjustments for tone and phrasing. Every clause was airtight. David and I had drafted them that way on purpose 5 years ago, anticipating a day when I might need an exit that didn't require my identity to be revealed. The liquidity clause had been my safety valve, a guaranteed buyback at a generous multiple if I ever wanted out. They had signed it eagerly back then, desperate for the cash, never imagining the silent investor might one day pull the trigger. $13.7 million, more than enough to cripple their current cash reserves, especially with whatever fleet acquisition they were attempting. They would have to scramble, dilute existing shares, take on high-interest debt, or beg other investors. And if they couldn't come up with the money in 30 days, the drag-along clause would force a full sale of the company. Every shareholder, Dad, Christopher, the minor stakeholders, would be compelled to sell. Vanguard Logistics, the empire my father had spent 40 years building, would pass into strangers' hands. Christopher's golden legacy would evaporate overnight. I hovered over the send button for only a moment. There was no hesitation, no second-guessing. The girl who had once wired $5 million out of love and lingering loyalty was gone. In her place stood a woman who had endured 31 years of being invisible, only to be remembered when they needed something. This wasn't emotional retaliation, it was simply business. They had taught me, after all, that family was conditional, and I had finally learned the lesson. I clicked send. The email disappeared into the ether with a soft whoosh, and I closed the laptop. Walking back to the balcony, I finished the last of the wine and gazed out over the city I had conquered on my own terms. Somewhere out there, my family was probably asleep, secure in the belief that their world was unshakable. In 30 days, or sooner, they would learn otherwise. For the first time in years, I felt truly powerful. Not because I was hurting them, but because I was finally choosing myself without apology. The glass child had shattered the pain from the inside, and the fresh air on the other side felt exhilarating. Let the countdown begin. The 30 days that followed my email to David unfolded like a slow-motion car crash. One I watched from the safety of my penthouse with a detached fascination that bordered on serenity. I had expected panic, of course. I had even anticipated anger. What I hadn't fully prepared for was the sheer spectacle of my family's unraveling. The frantic calls, the thinly veiled public tantrums, the desperate scrambling that revealed in high definition exactly who they had always been. It started the very next morning. My phone lit up at 7:12 a.m. with a call from Christopher. I let it ring out. A voicemail followed almost immediately, his voice tight, controlled, but with an edge I'd never heard before. "Alyssa, it's Chris. Dad got some legal notice yesterday from that ironclad group. They're trying to force a buyback we can't afford right now. It's predatory, total shark move. We're talking to counsel, but look, if you could float us that $2 million we discussed, it would buy us breathing room to renegotiate. Call me back. This is serious." I deleted the message and blocked his number for the day. By noon, Mom was trying. Then Dad. Then Emily. Her voicemail, a masterpiece of faux sweetness laced with urgency. "We're all so worried, sweetheart. Christopher's beside himself. This could ruin everything your father built. If there's anything you can do, even a portion of it, we'd be so grateful." Grateful. The word almost made me laugh out loud. Over the next week, the calls became a barrage. They rotated numbers, used the lake house landline, even had little Lily leave a tearful message asking Aunt Alyssa to call back because Daddy's really sad. I stopped listening entirely and set my phone to Do Not Disturb for all numbers except work contacts and David. Silence, I discovered, was a weapon sharper than any argument. While they hammered my voicemail, the public performance began. Christopher posted first, a cryptic LinkedIn update that read like a victim statement wrapped in corporate jargon. "True leaders are tested not in calm waters, but in storms created by those who hide behind anonymity. Grateful for the real relationships we've built over 40 years. Fake people and paper tigers will always reveal themselves in time." Within hours, Emily shared an Instagram carousel, black and white photos of the family at the lake house anniversary party. Everyone smiling, champagne raised, captioned, "Cherishing authentic bonds while navigating betrayal from unexpected corners." One family first, are real over fake. My mother, ever the subtle socialite, posted a throwback photo of Dad shaking hands with some senator with the line, "40 years of integrity can't be undone by 30 days of greed." The comment sections filled with supportive industry colleagues, former employees, and distant cousins offering prayers and outrage on their behalf. "Disgusting vulture capital," one wrote. "Stay strong, Hargroves," another encouraged. They painted themselves as noble defenders of a legacy under siege by a faceless, heartless investor. Not once did any of them pause to wonder why a silent partner who had saved them once was now pulling the plug. I watched it all from afar, sipping coffee on my balcony, occasionally screenshotting the posts for David in case we needed evidence of attempted reputational coercion. It was almost comical how perfectly they played the victims, never once considering that the vulture might be someone they dismissed for decades. Behind the scenes, David kept me updated with clinical precision. Vanguard's board, now aware of the ticking clock, held emergency meetings. They approached banks for loans, but the terms were punishing. High interest, personal guarantees from Dad and Christopher. They tried to sell minority stakes to friendly investors, but no one wanted to touch a company with a 37% overhang and a forced sale clause looming. They even floated the idea of an IPO to raise capital, only to realize there wasn't nearly enough time. On day 18, Dad showed up unannounced at my building's lobby. Security called me. I told them I was not at home and to escort him out. He left a handwritten letter with the concierge, 3 pages of reminiscing about my childhood, how proud he'd always been, a lie so blatant it stung, and a final plea. If blood means anything to you, help us now. I read it once, folded it neatly, and dropped it in the recycling. By day 25, the tone of the voicemails I occasionally sampled had shifted from pleading to accusation. Christopher again. If you're enjoying this silence, congratulations. You're watching your own family's legacy burn. Hope it feels good. Emily left one that dissolved into tears. How can you be so cruel? We're going to lose everything. Still, no apology for the garden party, no acknowledgement of Mason's words or the laughter that followed. Just entitlement dressed as desperation. David's final update came on the evening of day 30. Vanguard had managed to scrape together $4.2 million through a brutal combination of second mortgages, liquidated personal investments, and a short-term loan at predatory rates. It wasn't even close to the $13.7 million required. The repurchase deadline passed at midnight without payment. At 12:01 a.m., David formally triggered the drag-along provision. Within 48 hours, he had circulated a confidential information memorandum to a curated list of private equity buyers we had identified years earlier as strategic fits. 3 expressed immediate interest. By the end of that week, after a tightly run auction process, the winning bid came from Apex Global Partners, a $420 million all-cash offer that valued the company well above recent multiples. My 37% stake translated to just over $155 million wired quietly to Ironclad's accounts. The remaining proceeds were distributed pro rata to the other shareholders, enough for my family to remain very wealthy, but no longer in control. The closing happened swiftly. Christopher was forced to sign as CEO, handing the keys to a firm known for ruthless efficiency improvements. Half the corporate staff would likely be gone within a year. The Hargrove name would fade from the letterhead. I never spoke to any of them during those 30 days. Not once. On the morning the sale was announced publicly, Christopher posted a final LinkedIn message. A photo of the original garage where Dad had started the company captioned, "We built something extraordinary from nothing. Proud of every mile. New chapter ahead." No mention of loss, no humility, just the same polished bravado. I closed the app, poured myself a cup of coffee, and stepped onto the balcony. The city stretched out beneath me, vast and indifferent. For the first time in 31 years, I felt no tug of obligation, no lingering ache of exclusion. The empire they had worshipped was gone, and with it, the last thread that had ever bound me to them. They would blame the anonymous investor forever. They would never know it was the daughter they had looked straight through, the glass child who had finally stepped out of the frame and locked the door behind her. And that, I realized, was the most complete revenge of all. The closing took place on a crisp October morning in the glass-walled executive conference room on the 42nd floor of Vanguard Logistics headquarters. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding view of the river and the city skyline beyond, the same skyline I had watched from my penthouse for years. The room had been designed to intimidate. Long mahogany table, ergonomic leather chairs, a massive digital screen at one end displaying the company logo in triumphant blue and silver. Today, that logo felt like a relic. I arrived precisely at 8:55 a.m., 5 minutes early, dressed in a tailored charcoal pantsuit that cost more than most people's monthly salary. My hair was pulled back in a sleek low bun, minimal jewelry, no distractions. David Langford walked beside me, carrying a slim leather briefcase containing the final transfer documents. 2 associates from Apex Global Partners were already seated on one side of the table, along with their lead counsel and a transition team. My family occupied the other side, Dad at the head, flanked by Christopher and my mother. Emily sat slightly behind Christopher, clutching a tablet as if it were a shield. A court reporter and a notary waited quietly in the corner. The air smelled faintly of polished wood and fresh coffee, but beneath it lingered something sharper: nerves. No one looked up when David and I entered. They assumed we were more lawyers from the buyer's side. Christopher was murmuring something to Dad, who nodded grimly, his face drawn and pale beneath the expensive tan. Mom kept smoothing invisible wrinkles from her silk blouse. They had aged 10 years in 30 days. David cleared his throat. Good morning, everyone. On behalf of Ironclad Capital, LLC, the majority-selling shareholder, thank you for your time today. Christopher glanced up impatiently, ready to dismiss yet another faceless representative. Then his eyes met mine. For a moment, the room was utterly silent. I watched the recognition hit them in waves. First Christopher, his brows knitted, mouth parting slightly as confusion gave way to disbelief. Then Mom, who actually gasped, one manicured hand flying to her chest. Dad's head snapped toward me so quickly I thought he might strain something. Emily's tablet slipped an inch in her lap. I took my seat directly across from Dad, folded my hands on the table, and offered a small professional smile. Good morning, I said calmly. For those who don't recognize me without the garden party dress code, I'm Alyssa Hargrove, beneficial owner and sole decision-maker behind Ironclad Capital. The silence stretched, thick enough to choke on. I let it. David slid a folder across the table to Apex's lead partner, then placed an identical one in front of Dad. These are the executed share transfer agreements, wiring instructions, and board resolutions reflecting the drag-along sale. All signatures from Ironclad's side have been notarized. Christopher recovered first, though his voice came out hoarse. This is some kind of joke. No joke, I replied evenly. 5 years ago, when Vanguard was weeks from bankruptcy, Ironclad Capital injected $5.1 million in emergency funding in exchange for 37% equity and a silent board seat. That investment stabilized the company, allowed the pivot to resilient supply models, and ultimately multiplied the valuation enough to make today's $420 million exit possible. You're welcome. Dad's face had gone ashen. He stared at me as if seeing a ghost. You, he whispered. You were the investor? I nodded once. The entire time, Mom made a small, wounded sound. Why didn't you ever tell us? I met her eyes without flinching. Because you never asked. You never once wondered how I lived in a downtown penthouse, or what I actually did for work, or why I stopped coming to family events. You assumed I was struggling. You needed me to be struggling. It made your story cleaner. Christopher, the brilliant heir, and me, the quiet disappointment who couldn't quite measure up. Admitting that your overlooked daughter had built a $20 million net worth and then quietly saved the family empire would have complicated the narrative. Christopher's jaw worked soundlessly. His hands, usually so confident in boardrooms, were clenched into fists on the table. You let us beg, he said finally, voice shaking with something between fury and humiliation. You sat there and watched us scramble for 30 days, knowing... I didn't watch, I corrected gently. I heard the voicemails. I saw the social media posts about fake people and vulture capital. I read Dad's letter, and every time I waited for one thing: an apology. For the garden party. For Mason calling me a charity case in front of 200 guests. For 31 years of being looked straight through. Not a single one of you offered it. You just wanted money from the sister you'd written off? Emily's eyes filled with tears, but she said nothing. She had spent weeks posting about authentic bonds while treating me like background noise. Dad leaned forward, his voice cracking. Alyssa, sweetheart, we can fix this. We can undo the sale. You don't have to. It's done, I said simply. The funds have already been wired. Apex takes control at close of business today. Your shares have been purchased at the same multiple as mine. You'll each receive substantial payouts, enough to live very comfortably for the rest of your lives. You're wealthy, just no longer owners. The Apex partner cleared his throat politely. Miss Hargrove is correct. The transaction is irrevocable. Christopher laughed then, a short, bitter bark that held no humor. So, this was revenge, pure and simple. I considered the word for a moment, then shook my head. No, revenge would have been letting the company die 5 years ago when I had every reason to walk away. This was consequence. You taught me that family is transactional. I simply completed the transaction. I stood smoothing my jacket. David rose beside me. One last thing, I added, looking at each of them in turn. The narrative you've lived by, Victor and Christopher as self-made titans, Helena as the perfect matriarch, and me as the invisible afterthought. That story ends today. Not because I took the company, but because the truth is finally in the room. I was never the failure. I was the foundation you never bothered to acknowledge. I turned toward the door. Behind me, I heard Mom start to sob quietly. Dad's voice, hoarse and broken, called my name once. Alyssa? But I didn't stop. As the elevator doors closed and the 42nd floor receded, I felt no triumph, no gloating satisfaction, only a profound, almost weightless relief. The glass child had finally stepped fully into the light, and the reflection staring back at her was no longer transparent. The boardroom reveal wasn't the end of the story. It was the moment the old story died, and whatever came next would be written entirely on my terms. The elevator ride back up to the 42nd floor felt shorter this time. I had stepped out only long enough for the Apex team to finalize the wire confirmations and for the notary to stamp the last page. When I returned, the conference room had not emptied. No one had moved. They sat frozen in the same positions, as if the air itself had thickened and pinned them in place. Dad's eyes were fixed on the table. Christopher's face was a mask of barely contained fury. Mom dabbed at her cheeks with a crumpled tissue. Emily stared at her hands. I took my seat again. David remained standing behind me, a silent sentinel. I'm not quite finished, I said quietly. The Apex partners exchanged glances but said nothing. They had been briefed in advance. This was my stage now. I opened a thin black folder I had carried in with me and slid 4 bound reports across the table, one for each of them. Over the past 30 days, while you were busy posting about vulture capital and begging for bridge loans, Ironclad exercised its silent board rights to commission an independent forensic audit of Vanguard's books dating back to the 2021 investment. The firm we retained, Kroll Associates, is the best in the business. Their findings are illuminating. Christopher snatched his copy first, flipping through it with increasing speed. His knuckles went white. I didn't need to read from the report. I had memorized the highlights. Between 2022 and this year, the audit identified approximately $9.4 million in unauthorized or improperly documented expenditures charged to company accounts. Examples include 6 private jet trips to Cabo San Lucas and Aspen labeled as client entertainment with no clients present, a 2023 Porsche 911 and a 2020 Bauer Range Rover titled in the name of Morgan Hargrove, Christopher's 19-year-old son who has never worked a day at Vanguard. Over $2 million paid to a consulting firm owned by a college friend of Christopher's that provided no verifiable deliverables beyond quarterly PowerPoint decks titled Strategic Visioning. Personal shopping sprees at Neiman Marcus and Bergdorf Goodman charged as employee morale events. A lake house renovation billed as corporate retreat upgrades, complete with a new wine cellar and home theater. I paused, letting the numbers settle. Every one of these transactions violated the fiduciary standards outlined in the 2021 investment agreement, standards you all signed. More importantly, they triggered Section 9.7, the clawback provision. Any distributions or benefits derived from improper expenditures must be repaid in full, with interest, and may be offset against any proceeds owed to the responsible shareholders. Dad finally looked up, his eyes hollow. Alyssa, these were standard executive perks? Everyone in the industry? No, I interrupted, voice like ice. Everyone in the industry does not buy their teenage grandson a $250,000 car on the company dime while telling their daughter she eats last. Christopher slammed the report down. You can't just... I can, I said, and I have. The clawback has already been executed against your share of the sale proceeds. After offsets, interest, and legal fees, the remaining amounts due to Victor Hargrove, Christopher Hargrove, Helena Hargrove, and Associated Family Trust total 0. I let that word hang in the air. In fact, the overages exceed your proceeds by $1.8 million. Apex has agreed, as the acquiring party, to assume that liability in exchange for a modest discount on the purchase price, which means you don't just walk away with nothing, you walk away owing. Emily let out a strangled sob. Mom's tissue fell to the table. But I wasn't done. I reached into my briefcase and withdrew 4 black American Express Centurion cards. Titanium. Heavy, the ultimate symbol of the lifestyle they had flaunted for decades. Company cards, issued in their names, with unlimited credit lines backed by Vanguard's corporate account. One by one, I placed them on the mahogany surface in front of each of them. These, I said, were also audited. Over $500,000 in personal charges last year alone. Restaurants, hotels, designer clothing, first-class upgrades, all expensed as business development. I pulled a small pair of stainless steel scissors from my pocket, the kind used for ribbon-cutting ceremonies, and held the first card between my fingers. Christopher lunged forward. "Don't you dare!" I snipped, cleanly. The card split in two with a satisfying metallic click. I moved to the next. Snip, then Mom's, snip, then Emily's, snip. 4 ruined cards lay in a neat row, edges jagged. I gathered the pieces into a small pile and swept them into a crystal ashtray that had once held Dad's cigars. Your corporate accounts are frozen as of this morning. Personal lines of credit will follow once the banks review the audit. The lake house mortgage is underwater after the second lien you took out last month. The cars, the club memberships, the private school tuition deposits, everything tied to Vanguard's liquidity is gone. I stood. The charity case, I said softly, has just revoked the charity. David and I walked out. Behind me, I heard the first real sound of collapse. Christopher's voice breaking as he whispered, "We're ruined." The elevator doors closed on the scene, and I felt nothing but the quiet finality of a ledger balanced at last. In the weeks that followed, I watched from a distance as the family I had known disintegrated, not with dramatic explosions, but with the slow, grinding erosion of identities built on sand. Christopher and Emily's marriage fractured almost immediately. She moved out of the house they could no longer afford, taking Lily with her and filing papers that cited irreconcilable financial distress. Rumors reached me through mutual acquaintances. Christopher had become withdrawn, drinking too much, staring for hours at old press clippings of his visionary leadership. Morgan, the grandson who had been gifted the Porsche, sold it at a loss to cover credit card debt and vanished to a friend's couch in California, cutting contact with his father. Dad aged a decade and a month. Photos from a charity gala he still attended out of habit showed a gaunt, hollow-eyed man who smiled reflexively for cameras that no longer cared. Mom retreated to a rented condo, surrounded by packed boxes she couldn't afford to ship, posting throwback family photos on social media with captions about simpler times. They reached out, of course. Emails, letters, even a desperate voicemail from Dad recorded at 3 a.m., voice thick with tears. "Please, Alyssa, we're your family. We made mistakes, but we can heal this." I never responded. What fascinated me most, clinically almost, was how none of them expressed genuine remorse for how they had treated me. There were no apologies for the garden party, for the decades of dismissal, for raising a child to call me a charity case. Their grief was entirely self-directed. They mourned the loss of status, of homes, of the reflection they saw in the world's admiring mirror. It was textbook narcissistic injury. I had read about it years earlier during one of my late-night dives into psychology texts. The moment when a carefully constructed false self is shattered by reality. For people whose identity depends on being seen as superior, generous, enviable, the sudden exposure of fragility is unbearable. The pain isn't guilt, it's existential. The self they have sold to the world and to themselves no longer exists. And in its place is a void. That void swallowed them. Christopher's bravado collapsed into depression. Dad's pride curdled into shame. Mom's social grace turned to isolation. They didn't cry because they had hurt me. They cried because the story in which they were the heroes and I the footnote had been proven false beyond repair, and I felt no urge to rescue them from it. The final wire from the clawback adjusted sale hit my account on a quiet November morning. $12.9 million clear of taxes and fees. It wasn't the hundreds of millions I could have claimed if I'd held the stake longer, but it was more than enough. I sold the penthouse, too many glass walls, too much city noise, and bought a small cedar and stone house on 20 acres in the mountains, 2 hours from anywhere that knew the Hargrove name. There's a wraparound porch, a wood stove, a creek that runs year-round, and silence so complete I can hear snowfall. I furnished it sparingly. Books, art I love, a kitchen worth cooking in, no family photos, no reminders. 1 month after closing, a letter arrived in my new mailbox. Handwritten envelope, Dad's shaky script. Inside were 6 pages, memories of teaching me to ride a bike, regret for favoring ambition over affection, acknowledgement that they had failed you long before you ever failed us. It ended with a plea. If there is any part of you that still sees us as family, please call. We are so very sorry. I read it twice on the porch, steam rising from my coffee as the sun set behind the ridge. Then I folded it, placed it in the wood stove, and watched the flames take it. That evening, I cooked for one. Pan-seared salmon, roasted asparagus, a glass of good Pinot Noir. I set the table properly, linen napkin, candle, music playing softly. I ate slowly, savoring every bite. No one told me to wait. No one implied I didn't belong. The charity case was eating first, and it tasted like freedom.